Hello, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of our lecture on epistemology. So we pick up here talking about section 4 of our reading, and we want to talk about the sources of knowledge. So we've defined quite a few terms already. We've talked about internalism and externalism, roughly what they are, as well as the Gettier problem and the justified true belief account, the JTB account that has been very influential in the history of epistemology. Now we want to get into another very important conversation from the history of philosophy, and that concerns the sources of knowledge. So there have been roughly, not exactly, but roughly two schools of thought that have dominated the conversation in epistemology for many, many years, millennia really. And it concerns where knowledge ultimately comes from. So when we think about all the knowledge that we have, especially in our modern age, it's pretty easy to make a conjecture that knowledge comes from the senses. But obviously, our minds and our brains play a crucial function in processing knowledge and interpreting knowledge. So, really, this question is of utmost importance in epistemology. Where does knowledge ultimately derive? And the two schools of thought that have some overlaps, but certainly are two different approaches to this question, can be broken down into one view called rationalism and empiricism. So let's start with rationalism and try to support that view with some examples. So, according to rationalist philosophers, at least some knowledge is innate. And what we mean by innate is roughly born with. So a lot of people argue, for example, that language might be, or at least certain parts of language might be innate. We're born with those features, whether through evolution or through some other process like the soul. And according to rationalists, at least some knowledge, this is Plato's view, we're born with, and we might discover it later or we might uncover it, but there's some knowledge that might already be imprinted on the mind or the soul, and we know these things innately. So the mind can discover these truths through reason alone without appeal to experience. So some common examples that are often cited: mathematical truths. So many philosophers think that math is discovered through reason. We don't need the senses, for example, to learn about geometrical truths. I already mentioned language, universal laws of nature, like the law of excluded middle. Something can't both be and not be. That's just a law of logic that we can just discover through reason. So rationalism is, again, the view that at least some knowledge is innate, we're born with it, and the mind can discover such truths using human reason alone, without any appeal to human experience. And rationalism typically relies on this notion of a priori knowledge. So a priori is Latin for from the earlier, or prior to or independent of experience. So a priori knowledge concerns propositions that can be known before we experience anything in the world. So some examples, one we'll talk about in just a second, from Descartes, I think, therefore I am. And then other examples that are propositional, but are true by definition, right? All bachelors are unmarried men. We don't need experience to tell us that if you're a bachelor, you're an unmarried man, or if you're a bachelorette, then you're an unmarried woman, right? Those are just true independent of and prior to experience. So according to rationalism, we have some knowledge that we derive from using human reason alone. The other view that has been very influential in the history of epistemology is called empiricism. And we associate, for good reason, empiricism with the rise of modern science. And by modern science, I mean the scientific revolution, the so-called scientific revolution of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, right? The rise of Isaac Newton, Galileo, other key figures that really inaugurate this new push to give us new sciences, new physics, geology, things like that, biology. So empiricism is the view that knowledge comes from experience, not reason alone. It comes from our senses. And most empiricists think that we're not born with any innate knowledge. So what are some examples of that kind of knowledge? Well, descriptive statements about specific things in the external world. So for example, the example I used earlier, that the Earth is a third planet from the sun, I know that from experience. I don't know that by using just my reason. It's not implanted on my soul or something like that. I have to learn from experience. And so this would be a key example of knowledge from the senses. Empiricism typically relies on a posteriori knowledge, which means from the latter, and this means independent or after experience, right? It's not innate. So empiricists think that propositions can be known only after we experience things in the world. So another simple example, Barack Obama was the 44th president of the United States. We don't know that from human reason, but we certainly know that from experience. Some philosophers have thought that the best way to conceptualize knowledge is to think of or combine the best features of both views, both empiricism and rationalism. So that captures the view very roughly of the famous philosopher Immanuel Kant, who argued that knowledge comes from both sources. So there's certainly some philosophers who take the best of both of those views and try to give us an overall schematic of knowledge and its roots. One major challenge to knowledge that is mentioned in the reading and that maybe you've thought about in other contexts is the problem of skepticism. So skepticism comes in a couple different varieties, but very roughly, skepticism is the view about epistemology that we lack knowledge in some fundamental way. And it usually comes in various degrees. So if you're an academic skeptic, then you think that there are at least some realms of which we as humans are completely ignorant, that we can't have knowledge about certain topics. So maybe it's about religion. So some people who are academic skeptics think, look, if there is a God, we can't have any knowledge of God. That's just something beyond human comprehension. And so we can't really claim to have any knowledge of a God or gods or things like that, right? That would be one example of someone who's an academic skeptic. There's another strain of skepticism that we get from ancient Greece, as well as various Asian philosophers, called Pyrrhonian or universal skepticism. This is the view that we can't know anything at all, that essentially whatever account of knowledge we come up with, whether it's the JTB account or some other account of knowledge, we never really meet that bar because there's always some reason to doubt what we think we know, right? Whether it's your birthday or who your parents are or what the planet, what the order of the planets is. Because if you look back at history, we seem to always be wrong about everything. We are always updating our quote unquote knowledge. And it seems like whatever conditions for knowledge we give, we never really meet them. So according to Pyrrhonian skeptics, all because knowledge requires certainty and we're never certain about anything. Another challenge to knowledge that often comes up is relativism. And I think it's really important to emphasize here just how influential this view has become, especially in the last, I would say maybe 30 or so years. And even more pronounced than that, in my view, is how prominent relativism has become in this new age of fake news and misinformation online. A lot of people seem to be relativists, whether they know it or not, about knowledge. And there's a lot of other interesting things we could say here about this topic. But relativism, very roughly, is that truth just depends upon what a person believes. This is called subjective relativism. And if you're a subjective relativist, you think, look, if a person thinks it's true, then it's true. Sometimes people are cultural relativists. They think that, well, if a culture believes something is true, then it's true. But I think it's safe to say that there are a lot of people who might be more apt or more prone to believe in subjective relativism. Maybe you've heard people say online or in person, well, that's not my truth. One thing we should point out, though, is that I think many times people conflate opinions and beliefs with knowledge, right? So of course we can all have opinions on something, but whether or not it's knowledge, that's a different question. So I think when people say things like, that's your truth, not my truth, I really think when people say that, they really mean that's not my experience. Maybe that's your experience. So we might be just playing a little fast and loose with some of these terms, but I think nonetheless, it's safe to say that subjective relativism has become a very prominent view, given the rise of the internet age and given the rise of right ecosystem, news ecosystems, the bubbles that we might live in, where people genuinely live in different realities, perhaps. And so I wish we could spend more time talking about that, but I do think that relativism, safe to say, poses unique challenge to the view that knowledge is objective, right? Because if everyone just lives in their own world and what's true for you isn't true for me, then obviously that's going to pose a lot of problems for not only our conceptions of knowledge, but the functioning of healthy societies. So let's talk about the kinds of skepticism, or just fill in some of the details there. So again, Pyrrhonian or universal skepticism is usually the view that we should totally suspend our beliefs or claims to knowledge because no knowledge is possible. And then again, academic skepticism, we're just completely ignorant of knowledge from especially the senses. And as I have some pictures here, again, lots of influence from ancient Greek philosophy. This is Rene Descartes, and also some Chinese and Buddhist philosophers have contributed to skepticism, the skepticism literature, excuse me. Sometimes there are what are called moderate skeptics, and there are plenty of those in the history of philosophy. So this is David Hume. There is also Confucius, who advocates a kind of moderate particular skepticism. So if you're of this sort, then there are important realms which cannot be known. So usually if you're a moderate skeptic, you think, again, there are areas that we just can't know, like whether it's God or metaphysics or an afterlife or some things like that. We couldn't know them even if we wanted to. Okay, they evade the capabilities of the human mind and human knowledge. So if you're that kind of skeptic, you think, well, we might have some knowledge, but it might be rather limited. And there's certainly areas of human endeavor that we can't know because it goes beyond the bounds of what can be known anyway. Okay, so hopefully you're getting the sense that skepticism can come in degrees of a spectrum. Not every skeptic is of the same view, but certainly there are different sorts of skepticism that we can lay out and that come from different parts of the world and time periods. Okay, so let's talk about one very influential person who's had a big impact on the history of philosophy. This is Rene Descartes. He is a French philosopher. There are his years. Very influential mathematician, natural philosopher, metaphysician. He was responsible for championing an emerging worldview in the 17th and 18th centuries called mechanical philosophy, which sounds pretty, when we describe it, it sounds pretty familiar to our more modern conceptions of science, but it was quite a unique view to take at the time Descartes lived. What Descartes thought is that we can essentially describe nature by using pure mechanics like physics. And that was quite a unique view because prior to Descartes, there were a lot of views about how the universe worked that relied a lot on religions or on theology or God's working. And Descartes, who was religious himself, thought that, well, we can understand matter and motion by just looking at the mechanics of how those things work. And so this was a very big shift in how philosophers and scientists looked at the world thereafter. So Descartes was also very keen on trying to figure out how nature worked by talking about laws of nature, or the kinds of laws that we can derive from observation and from using human reason. And Descartes also sets the stage for somebody who's going to disagree with him quite heavily, and that's going to be Isaac Newton, who comes a little bit after Descartes. He's also responsible for helping us develop algebraic geometry. So maybe you've heard of Cartesian coordinate systems. So he had a lot of influence on mathematics. He also gave us arguments for God's existence, gives us interesting insights into the mind-body problem, as well as some views on skepticism. So in his infamous Meditations on First Philosophy, he provides a groundwork for not only epistemology, but also how we should conceptualize scientific knowledge in particular. Okay, so Descartes is a rationalist, so he does think that we use human reason, and particularly he sees sense experience as unreliable, an unreliable source of knowledge, because our senses often go wrong. We can be tired, we can be incapacitated, we can be dreaming. There are lots of reasons to doubt the reliability of knowledge that comes from the senses. So instead, he wants to give us a foundation. This is why we talked about foundationalism in the previous lecture. He wants to give us a foundation as firm as that which supports unshakable mathematical truths about knowledge. So he assumes that knowledge requires certainty. And he tries to do that to show that we can potentially arrive at a first principle of knowledge. So from all this doubting, from all the skepticism that we can entertain, he thinks, well, we can at least arrive at something. So he says, it seems to me that already I can establish as a general rule that all things which I perceive very clearly and very distinctly are true. And he does that because he gives us various interesting and compelling thought experiments about being deceived by an evil genius, being deceived by God, maybe dreaming, things that would later be used for things like computer simulation thought experiments. Like maybe this is all one big computer simulation to show that the senses are really unreliable. So how do we get out of skepticism, according to Descartes? Well, what's one thing that cannot be doubted? Well, if we're thinking, we exist. So if I think, therefore I am, hence the famous philosophical line, je pense donc je suis in French, which means I think, therefore I am. Because no matter if we're being deceived or if we're incapacitated or dreaming, so long as we're thinking, Descartes thinks, it's proving that we exist, because there has to be something there to be deceived. So Descartes thinks, here's our first thing that we can know. We know that if we're thinking, we exist. So there's our first piece of knowledge that serves as the foundation for all other knowledge that we can build on top of that. So I wish we were in class, because we could think of examples that that would satisfy Descartes' notion of something that we perceive clearly and distinctly. So maybe you can pause here and think about some examples of things that you really think that you know clearly and distinctly, and see if it matches up with how Descartes formulates it. But we'll leave this exercise aside for now. Okay, so he gives a couple of arguments that I've already mentioned. I'm not going to go over all the details here, but essentially what Descartes is doing is he's trying to show how we can get out of skepticism. And for him, the only way we can get out of skepticism is by not relying on the senses as a foundation for knowledge. Because as I mentioned, the senses are unreliable. They're not foolproof. In fact, they often lead us astray. We become dehydrated and see things in the desert. We don't get enough sleep and we start hearing noises. We eat some bad food and become disoriented, right? There are all kinds of examples where our senses deceive us. And because of that, Descartes thinks we should never want to build our system of knowledge, our foundation for knowledge, on something that's so unreliable. But what is reliable? Well, the human mind, human reason. And that's going to provide the solid foundation from which we can build the existence of God, minds and bodies, and then up to empirical knowledge. But it has to start with human reason, and it has to start with a thinking thing. And from there, we can build other things that we can know very famously. So here's a formulation of what is called Descartes' deconstruction argument. If certain sensory perceptions are occurring, then there is a source of the resulting beliefs. If we can doubt the reliability of these sources, then we should doubt the beliefs themselves. If we can doubt the beliefs themselves, then they are not knowledge. We can doubt the reliability of sensory perceptions for reasons I just mentioned. Therefore, we cannot know that they are occurring. So essentially, this is formalizing Descartes' argument against knowledge resting on empirical inputs, because if they can be doubted, then they can't be objects for knowledge. So they can't be the foundation, rather, for knowledge. Okay, and here's another argument for why we shouldn't trust the senses, Descartes' famous dream argument, right? Because like Descartes, you might think, well, I've had dreams that are so real, I thought I was in them. I thought it was real life. And Descartes says, yeah, that should show you that you should never rely on the senses to provide knowledge. So the argument goes roughly like this. If I am dreaming that some immediate experience, call it X, is occurring, then I can doubt that X is true or occurring. So it is possible that I'm dreaming that X, right? I could be dreaming right now that I'm looking at my computer screen, that I'm on Zoom. So since it's possible, I can't, and I can doubt it, I can't know it. It can't be the foundation for my knowledge. So given 1 and 2, I can doubt that X is occurring. If I can doubt that X is occurring, then I do not know X. Therefore, given 3 and 4, I do not know X. Same thing, we could be deceived right now while you're listening to this lecture or me giving it, that maybe there's some evil demon out there that's making us think that we're doing some philosophy when we're not. Maybe we're in the Matrix or in a computer simulation or something like that. Very famous argument, goes very similar to the previous one. Since it's possible to doubt it, you can't know it. And if I can doubt it, then I don't know it. So this is the famous evil demon argument. Okay, so again, just to recap what we can know, again, even if we're being deceived by an evil demon, and even if we're in a computer simulation or the Matrix, Descartes' overall argument, which has been so persuasive and so thought-provoking, is that, well, even if we're being deceived, there's got to be something there that's being deceived. And that thing is you. So long as you're thinking, you exist, right? So if I know that I'm doubting, even being deceived by an evil demon or God or dreaming or right, drugs or alcohol, things like that, then I must still exist because there has to be something there that's being deceived. So this is Descartes' famous way out of skepticism. I know that I exist clearly and distinctly because if I know that I'm doubting, then I must exist because there has to be something there to doubt, to do the doubting. Okay, so let's look at a famous empiricist. So Descartes is a rationalist because he thinks the senses are unreliable. There were a lot of attacks on Descartes that came afterwards. One was by John Locke, who we'll skip over for the moment. But another famous attack on the account of knowledge provided by Descartes is from the Scottish philosopher David Hume, who comes a little bit after Descartes, 1771 to 1776. He's often called the last great British empiricist. Many of his work has been described as the precursor to cognitive science and even some elements of psychology. So very influential writer, philosopher, and historian. His skepticism extended to belief about God. So much of what he said about God, he had to publish after he died because this is the 18th century and you couldn't really publish atheistic views and really get away unscathed. So a lot of what he said about God or lack of belief in God was published after he died. And a lot of what he said ended up influencing the great biologist Charles Darwin. So his view is that Descartes has it completely backwards. He thinks all philosophy and all science is influenced by the senses. And so he's going to give us an empiricist account of knowledge. So again, Descartes thinks that we use clear and distinct perceptions, rationalism as a foundation for knowledge. So it's only rationalism, and we only get knowledge through using human reason. And reason uncovers these ideas, like if we're thinking we exist, and even other things like God's existence we can prove by just using human reason. So that's Descartes' approach, which we just talked about. Hume thinks, nope, all we need to focus on is experimental methods of science and apply them to knowledge. So we need to focus not on reason, but on experience. And how do we do that? Well, that's what empiricism is about. It's about talking about how we perceive things, what the senses tell us. That's the only thing we can rely on. Knowledge only comes through the senses, not through reason. Sorry, Descartes. Reason might explain how we construct our complex ideas, but reason doesn't provide us the source of knowledge itself. Okay, so again, there are different kinds of skepticism. Descartes ends up not being a skeptic. He just uses skepticism to show that the senses aren't reliable. Hume, however, he thinks we have a reason to doubt all beliefs that aren't founded on experience. So that's why I said he's kind of the opposite of Descartes, because Hume thinks if it's not from experience, then we have every reason to doubt it. So again, Descartes has it backwards, according to Hume. It's not that we should trust reason. We shouldn't trust anything that doesn't come from experience. Okay, so Hume is often called, and I think appropriately, a moderate skeptic. So he doesn't think that we know nothing at all. He just doesn't think we know anything that's not founded on experience, as I mentioned, because he thinks these forms of skepticism we can't ever get out of. So he thinks Descartes, at the end of the first meditation, he can't get out of that doubt. He's already gone down the rabbit hole. There's no way for Descartes to get out of that. So Hume thinks a more appropriate position is to be a moderate skeptic. Okay, so he thinks the way that we should talk about knowledge and its sources is to separate the kinds of things that we claim to know. So Hume thinks there are matters of fact and relations of ideas. Matters of fact, like Mars is the fourth planet from the sun, those are contingent truths, right? Contingent because we have to discover it, we have to observe it, and it could have been otherwise, right? It could have been the case that Mars was the eighth planet from the sun, but it just so happens that it's the fourth planet from the sun, right? And that piece of knowledge is true or false because of the way the world or the universe actually is, right? For example, I know that Obama was president, or the 44th president. Is it possible that Obama wasn't president? Absolutely, right? Mitt Romney could have won in 2012, or John McCain, right? But that's the way things happened, but it could have been otherwise. So that's a matter of fact based on the way the world really is. And then we also have knowledge of what he calls relations of ideas. These are necessary truths, like all bachelors are unmarried men, or 2 + 2 = 4, because these are just true by definition, right? It's not like those are facts about the world. Those are just, we take the idea of bachelor and we know that the idea bachelor means unmarried man. It's not, there's nothing, there's no bachelor out in the world. That's just a human construct about language that's true by definition, right? So Hume thinks all knowledge can essentially be delineated through one of these two groups, and matters of fact, we know this stuff from experience, and that's pretty much it. I'm going to skip over this. Feel free to pause it here. I don't need to go too into detail about Hume, how Hume talks about this process, but again, I think I've already captured the main essence of Hume. All pieces of knowledge that we have, Hume thinks, and again, this is a precursor to cognitive science, come from experience or relations of ideas, but it's mostly experience. So I'm going to skip over this too. Okay. One thing that Hume talks about that is very interesting and had a big influence on subsequent science was his criticism of not only cause and effect, because he thought that we never observe cause and effect. We just see like one billiard ball hitting another billiard ball and saying things like, this ball causes this ball to move. We never actually observe the cause and effect. We just have the habit of expecting them to occur together in the future. So it really makes scientists after Hume think about what we mean by causation very interestingly. And one problem, I'm going to skip over this slide, is that he famously gives us is what's called the problem of induction. So he thinks that we have this habit of thinking that the future will be like the past. So take a simple example. The sun will rise tomorrow. Well, do we have knowledge of that? I mean, we think yes, right? The sun will be here tomorrow. That we have no reason to think that it won't. Now, is it possible that it won't? Yeah. Is it likely? Not really. But he thinks the problem is we claim to have knowledge about future events when we really don't have knowledge about the future, right? I mean, think about something that we think with absolute certainty is going to happen tomorrow. It could be anything from a political event, something that happens in your own household, to something just really mundane about, here's a better example, that my coffee tomorrow morning is not going to be poisoned. Um, well, I do live in a household with somebody else. Is it possible that they poison me? Yeah, or maybe I get a bad batch of coffee beans, right? The question that Hume is interested in asking and that relates to our purposes is, can I say that I know it? Can I say that I know that my coffee won't be poisoned tomorrow? Hume's famous answer is no. And the reason uh, that I don't know it is because the only claim I have, the only reason I have to say otherwise is because that has been the way it's been for the last X number of years. But just because something happens in the past doesn't mean it's going to be that way in the future. So this is the problem of induction, very famously. He thinks, um, well, if I try to get out of this famous problem, well, I've only got two options. We know that all arguments are either deductive or inductive, and deductive argumentation is not going to get us out of the woods because I can't give a deductive argument to justify inductive reasoning. But I also can't use inductive reasoning to justify inductive reasoning because that would be circular, right? That's fallacious reasoning. It'd be like, how do I know God exists? Because it says so in the Bible, and the Bible is the word of God. That's fallacious reasoning. That's circular reasoning. So Hume very famously thinks that no deductive argument can establish what he calls the principle that the future will resemble the past, because it'd be weird to use a deductive argument to justify induction. Similarly, I can't use induction to support the principle that the future will resemble the past, because that's circular reasoning. So he thinks essentially inductive reasoning, even in science, cannot be rationally justified, even though we use it on a regular basis. So very interesting, much discussed problem of induction that David Hume gives us that occupies a lot of very famous people for years to come. Even to this day, we talk about the problem of induction. And right, of course, we want to say that right, our food and our coffee is not going to be poisoned. We want to cling to our experience, right? We think that we know all kinds of stuff, but Hume thinks, look, this is what philosophy is about: thinking about deep problems and at least asking for justification for the reasoning and thought processes of things that we care about, like science, like philosophy, right? Things that we take for granted. That's what philosophy is all about, as we saw in the first week. Right? So Hume just wants to know what that reason is and what that justification is. And again, this is serves as the foundation, these questions, for cognitive science: how humans think, why we think what we think, as well as psychology, right? He wants to know what that is. He wants to know how the human mind works and when and where we're justified in thinking what we think. Okay, so here's a simple example that is captured in the cartoon. If the previous 5 minutes didn't make a lot of sense to you, I think this cartoon will hopefully make clear what Hume's worry is. So imagine we have two turkeys here. Okay, so the first turkey says, "Hey, ready to go get fed by the farmer this morning?" And then this turkey says, "I don't know. I have a funny feeling that maybe we should just stay away from the farmer today." And then the left turkey says, "What are you talking about? The farmer is our friend. He gives us delicious grain every day. What are you so worried about?" What is this turkey doing right here? He's using the assumption of the principle of the uniformity of nature. Every day, the farmer has fed the turkeys at the same time every morning. So this turkey is saying, look, by experience, we're going to get fed today. What are you so worried about? And then this turkey says, it just seems like things might be different today for some reason. And then this turkey gets all philosophical. Look, it's simple inductive reasoning. Every day for the past several months, we go see the farmer, and every day he feeds us. Therefore, it's reasonable to infer that the same thing will happen today. And in fact, the inductive inference that he will feed us is stronger today than it has been on any day before, which is pretty funny. So importantly, let's just reflect here on this. This turkey is saying, look, the reason that we're justified in thinking that we'll get fed today is because every day we get fed at the same time only strengthens the argument that we're going to be fed today, right? And then it changes the next day and the next day, right? So inductive reasoning is something we use all the time, right? And we think that it gets strengthened by every subsequent addition to that case, whether it's feeding pets or, right, my coffee not being poisoned or whatever example you want to think of. So the turkey seems to have convinced the skeptical turkey, well, when you put it that way, all right, let's go get some food. And then, of course, right, even if you've been fed every day for the last 365 days, today could be the day that the farmer kills you and eats you for Thanksgiving dinner, right? So I think that captures very well the problem of induction that Hume is after, because he's interested in this reasoning between the turkeys and asking, how is inductive reasoning justified, if at all? Because we seem to claim to know a lot of things from inductive reasoning, but is it justified? Hume is skeptical of that. And there's been a lot of philosophical and even psychological discussion about how to get out of such problems ever since Hume gave us this very famous problem a couple hundred years ago. So let me leave it there. Hopefully you enjoy talking and thinking about epistemology, and please let me know if you have any questions about the material or the terms. And thanks for listening as always.